Thank you for taking the time to pop in and watch this little video message. I wanted to take a few moments of your time as small group leaders just to talk about a particular aspect of leading small groups at City Church, and that is to do with the small group questions, those small group questions that we send out every week. Now, I know that some of you have been using them, some of you haven't, and I wanted to explain a little bit about the thinking behind the small group questions, why we're encouraging you to make this some part of what you do as a small group. And I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to explain why we're excited about this model, what the questions are supposed to do, and why we think it might be useful to you as a group and for your people. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about how I would expect you to use those questions in a small group setting, how you would use them to help you facilitate your small group. So, why do small group questions at all? Here's the theory. Every church has a teaching function, which simplistically would be trying to connect people to Scripture. And you and I know that there's a huge gap or a problem with scriptural literacy. People just don't really read the Bible anymore. People just don't read, full stop. So the idea is that we hope that God will speak to the leadership of the church about particular aspects of Scripture or particular scriptures that He's wanting His church, or this particular church, this body, to be thinking about at any particular time. And so the idea is that God will lead us to particular scriptures, that we teach those scriptures. And in essence, that's part of what happens on a Sunday morning. On a Sunday morning, we teach from the scriptures. But you and I know that half an hour on Sunday morning, once a week, even if it is once a week, is not really going to achieve very much. The average human being now sees something, they reckon, like 4,000 messages every day. On the television, on the radio, through email, through boards, commercials, on billboards. 4,000 a day, even if that was only half true, even if it was only 2,000, or even if that was only half true itself, even if it was only 1,000 messages a day. We know that it's very difficult to get messages through to people. But not only that, but teaching itself has changed radically in the last 50 years or so. We just don't have that many contexts where we sit and listen. And so it's slightly odd that the church has tended to stick with this model of, no, we teach at you for half an hour, 40 minutes once a week. But not only that, throughout the ages, believers have always been encouraged to engage with Scripture for themselves. Right back to pre-Christian Judaism, people would sit around and chew on the Scriptures, not necessarily to pin the Scripture down or pin the meaning down, but with this sense that Scripture itself would somehow interact with them and inform them and would do something in their lives. So here's why we're excited about small group questions. What it's doing is giving people another chance to engage with the same Scripture that's been dealt with on a Sunday morning. The Scriptures we hope and believe that God is directing us as a church towards. It's all about the Scripture. It's not about what Al says, or what Dave says, or what I say, or a visiting speaker. It's about the Scripture that God has brought before His church. And it means that people are getting more than one chance to engage with that Scripture. Sundays and then small groups. And maybe if people were encouraged to even look at that Scripture during the week, that would give you 3 hits. People who make commercials reckon now that today, to get somebody's attention or to get a message across, you need to hit them 6 times. Mostly churches do it once, and we expect it somehow to penetrate. I think that's unrealistic. So by doing small group questions, you're really helping your people engage with Scripture, and that is so important. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we would expect you to use the small group questions in your group to facilitate. And the first thing is to say, no, we are not insisting that you use them every week. They are a help, not a constraint, let alone some kind of prison. As a small group leader, we would expect you to be listening to God, listening to your people, and discerning where your group is. If you need a season to concentrate on worship, do that. Or pray a time to pray for a particular individual in a session, or to dig into an issue that keeps coming up in your group. That's what you should do. But what we hope is that the small group questions are like a home base. It's something that you constantly come back to, a basic framework that will work for you and your group. And apart from anything else, will make your job as a small group leader much easier. There's nothing more exhausting than constantly facing the question, oh, what should we do in our small group today or this week? It's exhausting, and you have to prepare it. So we hope that the small group questions will become part of the DNA of your group, not a constraint, but a help. So how do we imagine you using the questions? Well, the first thing to say again is that they're designed to focus on the scripture itself, not on what Al or Dave or I or anybody else said about that scripture. So here's not how to start. What did anybody think about what Al said on Sunday morning about Romans 4? That's starting in the wrong place. Start with the scripture. Start by reading it as a group. You might want to go around the group, everybody taking a few verses, or you could get one person to read it. You can experiment with that. Then I would not jump straight into the questions. Okay, let's do question 1. Question 1 says da 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 da. I would not do that. I would encourage people to take some time to look at the scripture again, having read it. Take some time, have a few minutes of quiet. Ask people to just look over that scripture, to reflect on it, look and see what jumps out at them, what speaks to them from that scripture. And then I would just see what comes out of that. It may immediately spark off a discussion. It may bring something up in somebody personal. It may raise a question that someone wants answering. See what comes out of reading the scripture. That's where you start. Go with it. Don't worry about the questions. If the scripture is doing its work, let it flow. But a couple of things. Sometimes not much comes up. Or, because people are people, this discussion goes off at a complete tangent to something that really has nothing at all to do with the scripture that you're looking at. You end up talking about football or your Aunt Sally's cat. So the questions then are there to help you, as a facilitator of your group, small group, to guide the discussion. Not control it, but to bring things back to the scripture, to prompt and stimulate the discussion, and to dig deeper into the scripture. So if I was leading, I would probably never refer to the questions directly at all. I'd have them sitting to one side so that I can look at them for myself. I would never read the questions out. Question 1 says ... Question 2 says I would never do that. I would just put them to the group in my own words if I felt they were needed or if they were helpful as a guide to the discussion, to help guide the discussion, not control it, but bring it back to the scripture so that we don't end up just talking about whatever it is. And I would rephrase the questions in my own way, as if they were coming from me rather than something that is written on a page. And here's the thing, if you take 5 minutes or so before your small group to read the scripture in question and then the questions, praying them into a bit maybe even, in preparations, those questions will be kind of in you. And it's an easy preparation for you. We know that it's hard work leading a small group and we want to make things as easy as possible. And in the end, the whole thing should feel like a great conversation, a chat with a natural flow, not an examination with questions and answers. Use the small group questions to help stimulate and guide the flow of the conversation, to bring things out of the scripture that you might not otherwise have looked at. But it's a flow that points people constantly back to scripture. The same scripture that we had a look on Sunday, a second chance or maybe even a third chance to think about and dig into that scripture. It's as simple as that. So we really encourage you and your group to start using the questions to help your people engage with the scripture that's been brought to their attention on a Sunday. You don't have to do it all the time. You need, as a small group leader, to be led by God first. But there may be times in the church's life, in our church's life, where we feel particularly that God is leading us to stress some aspect of this life of faith or some particular aspect of Scripture. And it's really helpful for us to know that you as small group leaders can help us in that task of bringing those Scriptures into people's lives, helping them to engage with them in a meaningful way, not just listen, but really engage with those Scriptures. And I believe it will also make your life as a small group leader a lot simpler and more effective. So that's why we want to do small group questions. And as I said, I think it's an exciting model and something that we should really engage with.